Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 311, Sunday, January the 14th, 2018. Thank you so much for tuning in to this Sunday weekend edition, the Sunday evening edition. Hopefully not too late in the evening, but hopefully I'll have this video up by 7, 8 o'clock, something like that. So hopefully it won't be too late in the evening. Okay, so what I wanted to do today, over the past, it seems like 2 or 3 weeks, we've been really heavy on just new information almost every day, tons of breaking information, many different things going on. So what I want to do in today's video is just try to take a look at everything that's going on, put everything into perspective, kind of evaluate and analyze where we are and where we're heading with all this, with all the other things that are going on, because it does get kind of confusing even for me, and I follow this stuff every day. I mean, we have all these different things going on. We have, of course, we have the Clinton Foundation pay for play that is back in investigative mode now, and of course we know that that's actually occurring in Arkansas, so they've got it out of D.C. That's actually being handled by a U.S. attorney in Little Rock, Arkansas, who was appointed by Trump and who is a friend of Tom Cotton. And Tom Cotton tells us that this U.S. attorney is a straight shooter. And so this investigation now, looking into Clinton Foundation pay for play, that's happening in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's not being run out of D.C. There's 4 other field offices also involved in that, and other states, including I think New York, and I'm not sure of all the other ones because they haven't really disclosed that, but there's 4 or 5 different FBI field offices with the lead role being taken by this U.S. attorney in Little Rock, Arkansas, looking into Clinton pay for play and the Clinton Foundation, and that dovetails into Uranium One, which is also being looked at right now within the Justice Department. Of course, we have the email server investigation being looked at again. So we have all these things going on, and of course then we have the investigations into the dossier and all these sorts of things. So we have a lot going on. Of course, I focus primarily here on TowerGate on the surveillance, which led to the illegal surveillance, the unmasking, which led to the deep state coup. The dossier is all a part of that. So that's where I primarily focus, even though I do look at the other things on the peripheral. That's where my main focus is, because there's so many things going on that if you try to cover every single thing, it all runs together to me, and it's hard to understand. There are some guys that do that, and they tie everything together, and they do really well. I mean, you see like Alex Jones loves to tie all these things together. George Webb does a very good job of doing this. But for me, you get so much stuff going that you can never actually identify any one thing, because you've got a million things going on. So it's good that all these investigations are really separate and compartmentalized, you know, so that you have an email investigation being handled over here. You have the Clinton Foundation pay for play being handled here. You have the Uranium One thing being looked at. Then you have the surveillance and the dossier and all this sort of stuff. So, you know, you really have to separate these things out because they're so complex. They're so rich in detail that, you know, it's hard. Even though you can probably tie it all together if you want to. It's interesting to do that, but it also makes it more confusing to understand what's going on. So just want to try to focus on what I typically focus on, which is the deep state coup, which is all part of the dossier, the surveillance, the unmasking, and all that. So that's where I want to try to focus most of my energies and stay on that, because I really believe that when you unravel the dossier, it's everything really. When you take care of that, everything else falls. The emails, the server, Clinton Foundation, all that falls, because the target here is the deep state, really. This collaboration between the Counterintelligence Division of the FBI, the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, their association and collaboration with the Clinton campaign. Fusion GPS is a contractor, Chris Steele is a cutout, and then all the other things that surround that with the so-called intermediaries, his sources, and all that. So I'm going to be getting into that a little bit more toward the middle end of the video. But for now, just to keep everything really simplified, because it can get very complicated, there's really 3 main things that you have to do to take this dossier investigation or the deep state coup to where we want to get it, which is to bring justice to the people who were involved in it and reveal the truth about what actually happened and hold people accountable. And there's really 3 steps. The first step is where you actually have inquiries that may reveal probable cause that a crime has been committed and therefore warrants an investigation. And that is where we are now. The inquiries are happening, and they're happening by way of 4 different committees in the Congress: the House Judicial, the House Intelligence, the Senate Judicial, the Senate Intelligence, and we also have the Oversight Committee, which kind of looks at everything too. So you really have 5 different committees. You have many different journalists, independent researchers out there looking at this story, looking at all the things that went on. And what you're trying to do is try to find that there's probable cause that a crime has been committed. Now, once all these investigations are over, and keep in mind, we also have the Inspector General, Mr. Horowitz, the custodian, who's also already began sending his information over to the Congress. This started Friday night. He has over 1 million pages of documents, and he sent the first batch over this past Friday evening. So now they're also getting, in addition to their own investigations, they're getting the Inspector General's reports on everything that he's discovered. And so all these things are going to culminate together, and at some point within probably the next 2 to 3 months, probably less than 3 months, all these things will have pretty much concluded. They will have interviewed all the witnesses, looked at all the documents, checked out all these records, email conversation, things that came from the IG, things that came from the 4 or 5 different committees looking at it, things that came from journalists working these stories. All this will come together. It will be put into some kind of a report, and it will be sent to the Attorney General, who will then make a decision if there is probable cause, if it looks like there's probable cause that crimes were committed. If so, then we go to step 2, and that is to appoint a special counsel or a special prosecutor, whatever you want to call it, and seat a grand jury. And then they begin to bring in the witnesses, bring in all the documents and all the evidence, and they move forward with the grand jury to find out exactly, get everyone on record. And then once they have everyone on record and they have all the testimony and all the evidence, they move to step 3, which is to file indictments on anyone who they believe was part of any of this criminal conspiracy. So that's the 3 steps, really. The inquiry to find probable cause of a crime, assuming that that is done and they do find probable cause, they refer it to the Department of Justice, who then reviews it, appoints a special counsel, and seats a grand jury. At that point, these people will come in, they're questioned under oath, whole 9 yards. Evidence is all brought forward, at which point we go to step 3, and that is where they actually file the indictments, and that's when the actual hearings and trials all begin. Deals also get cut during that time period. People who realize they're now under indictment have an option of either becoming a witness for the prosecution, cooperating, or they get a defense attorney, they keep their mouth shut, and they hopefully limit the liability or criminal liability that they're facing. So this is how the process is going to play itself out, and it gets kind of confusing with everything, but we're really just in step 1. We're getting toward the middle of step 1. In the next 2 months, probably, I would think, most of that will be wrapped up and we'll move to step 2. So this does take time for all this to play itself out and work itself through the system, because there's so much involved, so many witnesses, so much evidence, so much going on with this. It's very complex, much more than Watergate. Watergate was basically a burglary that was paid for by the campaign to re-elect the president, creep. And it was basically simple. The campaign to re-elect decided they wanted to get some dirt on the Democrats. They put together these guys, Liddy and Hunt and these guys, and they went into the Democratic National Committee to plant some listening devices to get some documents and photograph them to use them in a political campaign against the Democrats. They got caught. The money that they found on them was in $100 bills. It was in series. They were able to trace the money back to the Creep Fund, the campaign to re-elect the president, and once they traced that money back to the campaign to re-elect the president, Nixon, it put them inside the White House. Once the White House realized that, they had to begin a cover-up. So it was a very much more clear, cut, and dry thing, and that took 2 years and 10 months to work itself out. What you have here is a much broader conspiracy, many more players, a lot more going on. So it is going to be very labor-intensive to get through all this. We're just going to have to be patient and make sure that they continue to pursue it and make sure it follows all three of the steps we just talked about. We want it to go, we want to be able to have the inquiry. We want it to then lead to a prosecutor and a grand jury, and we want to have the trials happen and find the individuals who are guilty of crimes to be held accountable for those crimes. Okay, so that's kind of the long and short of it, to kind of put it into a clearer, simpler context that we can actually digest and understand without getting really confused and frustrated about why it's taking so long and all that. So this is why it is taking so long, and there's so much to do. Now, another question you have to ask yourself as we're going through this inquiry, the first step of the process, the inquiry process, where congressional committees are calling these people to come and testify, which will be happening throughout the course of the next couple of weeks. You know, they're going to be calling Peter Benstrokinus, Lisa Page, Bruce Orr, possibly, I guess, Bill Priestap. They're going to be calling all these individuals, and they're going to have an opportunity to do one of two things: either answer questions or plead the fifth. Now, there's danger. They're going to be told, of course, plead the fifth, but once you do that to these congressional committees and you say, well, I'm not going to talk to you, I'm going to plead the fifth, I'm not going to incriminate myself or whatever, at that point, yeah, they can do that, but that's almost guaranteed that when the investigation, the inquiry process comes to an end, it's almost guaranteed that you are going to be a person who is going to be subpoenaed by the grand jury and the prosecutor, and at some point you are probably going to have to testify. If you do not, and you get to that proceeding and you again plead the fifth, you're essentially not providing any defense for yourself, and you put yourself in a situation where, you know, you're basically leaving it up to everything else that's happening to decide what your fate is going to be. So it's a dangerous proposition. It's tricky to put yourself up there on the witness stand, especially if you're guilty, but it's also very tricky to plead the fifth and not say anything that could also lead to your defense. But this is a critical time when you have this going down, because this is also when a lot of people cut deals. So we'll have to watch very carefully and see if these individuals, when they testify or called to testify in front of Congress, whether they choose to actually cooperate and testify and answer questions, or whether they plead the fifth. We won't know until we actually see what they do. But if they do, they can almost be certain that when a grand jury and a prosecutor is appointed, when you stonewall, essentially that's almost like telling someone, well, when you stonewall, it's almost like saying, yeah, well, I'm pleading the fifth because I don't want to incriminate myself. You're basically saying I'm guilty, but I'm not going to help you prove it. And so you make the state prove their case. In which case, with all the other witnesses and documents and things they have, they might just well be able to do that. In which point, you've now put yourself in a position where you had a chance to cut a deal or defend yourself, but you've now waived your right to do that. Because when you waive your right to incriminate yourself, you also waive your right to defend yourself. Keep that in mind. So this is kind of where we are, and we'll just have to wait and see whether these people talk to the Congress or not. There is a, here's one other thing. This week that happened, which was fairly important, that I don't even think we even talked about, which is that a federal judge has now ruled that the FBI must turn over all of those Comey memos. And I believe there are 10 that they're basically really interested in. These would be the memos that Comey admitted that he put together after his conversations with President Trump. So Judicial Watch had gone to court suing to get these records, and now the judge, the federal judge, has made the ruling, and that ruling is that the FBI does have to turn over these memos, the Comey memos, to Judicial Watch. Now, they won't just be turned over to Judicial Watch, but probably within a couple weeks of being turned over to Judicial Watch, they will also be posted on some .gov, one of these various .govs that they use. Maybe it'll be the DOJ or the FBI. One of these .govs will also put the Comey memos up there. So we have that going on. Next, there is a rumor going around that we should probably talk about for a minute. And the rumor is that in an act of desperation, that Uncle Bob, the executioner Mueller, may go for a last-ditch effort and hit Trump with money laundering charges. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about the President of the United States, so you cannot bring charges against the President of the United States in a regular type court hearing or whatever. You don't send the President to federal court and court hearings and stuff like that. In issues regarding the President of the United States being accused of crimes, it does not go through the normal process of a normal court system. It goes to the Congress. They are the ones who would hold impeachment hearings. Both houses of Congress would hold these hearings, and that's how that situation will be worked out. And this is the danger for Mueller to do this, because it's not like he's just going to turn this over and then it's going to go to a federal court, a federal judge, and a jury. No, issues regarding the president being accused of committing crimes, that is done by the Congress through impeachment hearings. So they would have open hearings, they would bring in all these witnesses, and they would try to make the case that Trump was guilty of money laundering. And that's kind of, it's kind of difficult. Of course, Trump would have his attorneys and all that kind of stuff representing, giving defense. There would be people defending as well as people speaking for the idea that he was engaged in this. But it would, excuse me, it would be a big, ugly, long, drawn-out thing that it gets very dirty, and it destroys the political environment in Washington. It's a very risky thing to do. A lot of people are rumoring that Mueller might go that route. I'm not so sure he will. Again, because it doesn't follow the normal court procedures or anything like that. It will play itself out in the public in open hearings in the Congress as impeachment hearings. And so to slap Trump with money laundering and to throw all that into the Congress, I think is a very risky maneuver, especially with everything else that's going on. And I just think that could backfire very badly. I think my guess is that Mueller's probably looking for the easiest way out of this thing, where he can save face but still get a few scalps, but get out of it. For him to go all the way and to try to drop money laundering on Trump would turn into a three-ring circus, and it's just a very, very risky proposition, even for Uncle Bob to do. So I know it's out there. People are talking about it. We'll see what happens. I would guess it's not going to happen, but let's wait and see. Now, as I've talked about before, there's a lot of distractions and a lot of things going on. We learned this week about two major revelations from Conservative Treehouse, from Sundance, about the fact that Admiral Mike Rogers is going to be a key witness as to the illegal activity that was going on regarding the surveillance. Now, it kind of ties into the dossier, dovetails into the dossier, but specifically what Mike Rogers will be testifying to is that he observed illegal activity going on with the FISA warrants. He went to the FISA court, he went to the DOJ, he told him what was going on, he shut down the program, and at this point he's announced he's going to resign as NSA director. He'll be free as a civilian to testify. He'll be probably the chief witness for the prosecution as to what happened with the illegal activities by the Department of Justice, which would be the National Security Division, and also the Counterintelligence Division of the FBI. So this is where that kind of goes. And then we also learned that the relationship between the FBI and Fusion GPS likely began long before June or July of 2016, which is what we've been led to believe up to this point. It looks like possibly that relationship went back to even as early as sometime in the late summer or fall of 2015, possibly even before that, because we know now that Fusion GPS had been given access to the FBI database, which is linked to the NSA database, where they were able to get these FISA 702.17 queries, which form the basis for the background information, which is what gave them what they needed to get the initial FISA warrant when they actually went through the FISA process. But prior to that, it appears that Fusion was accessing the NSA database via the FBI systems. So those are two important points. But really, this stuff gets really a lot of stuff going on, and it gets kind of confusing. But it's, as I talked about 2 weeks ago, I did a video and I really talked about the thing to really keep our eye on is Christopher Steele. Now, we know that, let's see, basically what I said about 2 weeks ago is that Christopher Steele is the key to everything because the dossier is writing on him and everything is writing on the dossier. Grassley and Graham have referred Christopher Steele this past week for criminal investigation for lying to the FBI. And this is possibly what they're talking about is about the distribution. Because in the civil suits, Christopher Steele has basically said in his deposition that he did not want it to become public, that he meant it to be only for the CIA or intelligence or the FBI to look at, and that he wasn't, that he didn't authorize making this public or for BuzzFeed to put it out there or for people to go out and give it to all these media outlets. The only problem with that is that during Glenn Simpson's testimony, he openly admitted, and we already know from factual evidence, that Christopher Steele came to the U.S. 2 times on behalf of Glenn Simpson to personally brief Yahoo, New York Times, Washington Post, several other media organizations, The Guardian. He briefed about a half a dozen different major media organizations on 2 occasions on the request of Glenn Simpson, because Glenn Simpson was mad because none of these news outlets were taking the information he was feeding them because they couldn't corroborate it. So he said, hey, I'll get my man Christopher Steele to come over, and that will lend credibility to it and give the media the confidence they need to go ahead and publish some of this stuff. But even after those meetings with Christopher Steele and these media people, they still didn't feel comfortable enough to publish anything. So Christopher Steele was caught in a bit of a problem here, and this is why his attorneys are fighting so hard to keep him from having to testify in the 2 civil suits, the one in the UK where he's already done a deposition, and also in the case in Florida against BuzzFeed where he has done a deposition, but he's fighting both places not to have to testify personally, because essentially he becomes a witness for the other side, because they want him to testify that he cannot vouch for what's in the dossier. Remember, Christopher Steele, in order for him to his position and the position of GPS Fusion and the position of BuzzFeed and the position of some members of Congress and the members of the media is that most of the story is true. Most of the dossier is true. But in order for that to hold water, Christopher Steele is going to have to produce the evidence of that. He is going to have to disclose those witnesses. Now, we believe he did disclose those sources to Uncle Bob when Uncle Bob's people interviewed him, but so far he has not disclosed that anywhere else. We think we know who they are, but all those people who, when they've been asked, say they weren't the source, that they didn't say any of this stuff, and it's all crazy talk. So Christopher Steele, the only thing he can do to prove that his so-called his dossier, which we know it's not his dossier, but the only thing he can do is to prove it. And the only way he can prove it is to release the names of his sources, his intermediaries, allow them to be interviewed. He's going to have to prove that what he put in the dossier, allegedly put in the dossier, is true. If he cannot or will not do that, the dossier dies. It becomes unproven. So this is the reason that Christopher Steele does not want to talk, because he's in a tough position. He needs the dossier story to be accepted as being mostly true for him to save his neck, for BuzzFeed, Fusion GPS to save their neck, for the media to save their necks. Because remember, when this whole thing collapses, it's not just the deep state, people at the DOJ, FBI intelligence, maybe the CIA. It's not just people in the Obama administration. It's not just them who are going to go down. Remember, the mainstream media, the corporate media, has been a part and parcel of this entire takedown, this entire coup. They've been a part of it. They've been involved in it. And this is all going to be disclosed. So this is why the media is hanging on to the dossier as true as well. A lot of people have a lot of things writing on the dossier. And every bit of that dossier is writing on Christopher Steele. He is the guy who is either going to prove it or not prove it. So you have to wonder what he's going to do. Will he at some point decide that the best thing for him to do is to come clean and to tell the investigators the truth about who really wrote this dossier, what his role really was, and whether there are even any sources or intermediaries at all, or if maybe those sources and intermediaries were right from the counterintelligence division of the FBI and Fusion GPS. Maybe Glenn Simpson, his wife, Nellie Orr, Bruce Orr, maybe these are the intermediaries or the sources. Who knows? But one thing's for sure, it's all going to come down to Christopher Steele. It's all riding on him. Every bit of it. Either he discloses his sources and intermediaries, and they can be interviewed and questioned, or he can produce some documentation or some records, something. He's got to produce some evidence. He cannot just go out there and say, yeah, well, I believe it's mostly true. It's not going to work. He's going to have to prove it. And I don't think he can. Christopher Steele was basically the Rotten Reverend Clinton's hired gun. He was the fixer. But it's interesting that this so-called brilliant spy wasn't even brilliant enough to know that the Rotten Reverend Clinton was the person that was actually paying him through Confusion GPS. And this is what we learned from Glenn Simpson's testimony that was released by Senator Turn Your Guns, Mr. and Mrs. America Feinstein. Glenn Simpson's basically told them in the testimony that, as far as he knows, Christopher Steele did not know that the Rotten Reverend Clinton was the final payee, that she was the one actually paying. That's kind of interesting that he would be this super spy, yet he wouldn't know who was the end payer. Because, I mean, he knows that Fusion GPS is obviously being paid by working for somebody. Fusion GPS, would obviously have a client. And that client would be the same client, his client as well, because he's working on behalf of Fusion GPS. The fact that Simpson's saying that Steele wouldn't have known that is a little laughable. Or it means he's not a very good spy. We also know of something else about Christopher Steele, as he is an openly devout socialist. We also know now that Steele was likely being paid by the FBI and the Rotten Reverend Clinton because someone continued to keep paying him after the end of the campaign. And we know now from Glenn Simpson that after the campaign ended, once Trump won, they stopped making payments. But someone obviously kept paying Christopher Steele. Who was that? It could only really be the FBI. And so I ask another question again, as I did a couple of weeks ago when we talked about this. Why would the Russian sources give this type of information to Steele, or his intermediaries to give to Steele? Why would they do it? For money? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're one of these people who would have such a closely held intelligence secret by the Russian government, not many people would even know about it. You would have to be in the actual top tier, right around Putin, top tier of intelligence in Russia, knowing good and well that if you leak this information to someone, it wouldn't take long to figure out who it was, and you would never live long enough to spend the money that you were paid. It would be suicide. So none of this makes sense. And why would the Russians give up this intel? Why would they do it? Again, not for money, because you would never live long enough to spend it. And why would they give it to Steele and his intermediaries? Who are they? I mean, it's like, of all the people they may give it to, they certainly wouldn't have given it to some intermediaries to give it to Steele. And Steele is not stupid enough, as a former British spy, to know that if he had that information that he got through his intermediaries, and he went and took it and gave it to someone in the United States, an opposition research company, and then he went and sat down with all these media organizations and started feeding them all this stuff, Christopher Steele is smart enough to know, knowing about the Russians and how they operate, that his life would be in danger for the rest of his life. He'd be looking over his shoulder. And he would do that for 168 grand? Is that what his life is worth? See, it doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense, that his sources were high-level Russian intelligence, or that this was real, actual, high-level intel held by the Russian government. It would never get out. It would never get out, and anyone who let it out would be killed, tortured first, then killed. And anyone who was out there spreading it and received it would also probably face similar consequences. So this is what doesn't make sense. Also, if Steele is so confident that his dossier is 70 to 90% true, why has he been ducking every single attempt and every opportunity he's had to talk to congressional committees, to talk to the media, to talk to federal investigators? We know he talked to Mueller, but he hasn't gone anywhere beyond that, and nothing that's he said to Mueller has come out of Mueller's investigation. That certainly hasn't been leaked. So if he thinks it's so important that the Russians are hacking the election and he must get this information out to the world, that the FBI had to know, the DOJ had to know, the media had to know, everybody had to know, then why isn't he out there openly telling us? It's all being done behind closed doors, like it's part of a political espionage operation, because it was. So that's not believable. And it's not, they tell us he's this great pro, ex-professional, intelligence guy. Professional intelligence guys do not run around doing what he did. Spreading this stuff around, passing it on to media organizations, and operating the way he was doing. If it was real intelligence, real high-level intelligence, real, actual, true information, he wouldn't be treating it the way he did as a professional spy. And it never... And nor would Fusion GPS have treated it that way, nor would any of these media organizations have treated it that way. It was being treated like a political hit piece because it was not a piece of intelligence, high-level intelligence held by the Russian government. Makes no sense. That would essentially be a death sentence for Christopher Steele. If this was all real, if this was real high-level intelligence held by the highest level of the Russian government, for him to be out, as well as Fusion GPS and anyone else, Papagalopoulos, Mr. Downer, any of these people out there spreading this stuff around, doing what they did, knowing good and well how secret this intelligence would be to the Russian government. It just, none of this makes any sense. And I think that this is why I think that there is a possibility that when the rubber hits the road and Christopher Steele realizes that this game has been run out as far as he can go, and he can no longer defend himself, and he finds himself sitting in front of some investigators, prosecutors, a grand jury, what have you, and he has to make a decision. I think it's very likely that Christopher Steele will save his neck. How far will he go? I mean, is he going to go lie and continue to sell all this stuff to federal investigators? They're going to say, well, you got to prove it. And in order for him to prove it, he has to give up who the intermediary or intermediaries were, and he has to give up the sources. And they have to be questioned as well. You got to prove it. Christopher Steele has got to prove his dossier, or the whole thing dies. And he goes down with it. And he knows that. He might come to the conclusion, and based on advice from his attorneys, that the best thing to do, maybe, is just to go ahead and tell the truth. Just tell the truth, cooperate with the investigation, tell the truth, quit playing this silly game, and save your neck, your reputation, and your livelihood, and your freedom. Because lying to the FBI will get you thrown in jail, even if you are a British spy. So this is kind of where everything is. I'll be back tomorrow with another standard TowerGate video, and we'll look at what's been breaking in the last 24 hours. Thank you so much for tuning in. You guys have a good Sunday evening. Take care. Bye.